This is the God, Man and Markets podcast, conversations on faith, culture and the economy.
Last time we talked about, we pursued our conversations on the common good, and we discussed two publications, two articles, one by Sorab Amari and one by Adrian Vermeulen, where they gave their own perspective on the common good and what should be done, and essentially saying that their understanding of the common good doesn't exclude the political authorities from being a little bit more authoritarian, so to speak, as compared to where they are, um, or what they're doing right now, um, because the common good essentially, requires, the political authorities from directing the people into a shared goal or a shared view of what communal life is about, and so we critiqued that point of view, um, which seemed to be a little bit at least anti-classical liberal. But now I'm wondering if at the same time, we thought that there was a problem with the libertarian view or the classical liberal view, since essentially our modern societies are the product of it, or seem to be the product of this liberal order. And so, what do we do? We touched a little bit briefly on the question of the Benedict option. I want to discuss a little bit these things a little bit more concretely, but rehashing what you, Father Brad, explained about the common good. So it's a metaphysical final cause of living in society, and it's something that naturally draws everybody towards, right? We don't need to be coerced into loving the common good. We all naturally want to live in society and want to live in the political community, and want to sort of participate in the division of labor,
Exactly.
which is the essence of living in a political community. Um, but here we are in liberal societies, in societies that almost by definition have a misunderstanding of the common good, or misunderstand the common good, and with institutions that uh, not only misunderstand it, but essentially promote an opposite view of the common good. And so, given that we live in this uh, liberal order, how do we go about loving it despite its liberality? Um, and at the same time, we love liberty, so we actually love the fact that it respects human, to some extent, it respects human freedom. So those are my thoughts. I mean, I don't have. Maybe I'll open it up to anyone who wants to comment on those questions. Um, do we stand by and just change the culture in our own corner of where we live, and try to change change the cultural landscape, and in hope that that the country will move in the direction that we think is more appropriate?
Well, I mean, I will step in and comment, uh, Michelle, on just that last point. That what do we do practically? Do we just stand back uh, and focus on our own particular sphere, where we have influence with this our local communities? What has been called now the Benedict option, and I think to a degree the answer is yes, because that's always the response. Uh, that's always, I think, the authentic Christian response in the world at any age of history is, um, to in light of the kind of macro errors that we see, or the macro cultural global political trends, we simply focus on where we have agency, what we as individual personal Christians can do in our families and in our communities to make our world, meaning our sphere, our communities, make them more represent a true communal order towards the good. Uh, if that's what we mean by the Benedict option, then I would say then that's not really an option. That's just the Christian instinct in general, to always focus on the local. I do think that there's a slight perversion in our thinking in the modern world, because in the modern world, in the post-Hobbesian world, I think when we have this idea of the super state, where from sea to shining sea, we have one huge nation which is considered a whole, like the United States of America, or like China or Russia, these massive bodies, that perverts our focus away from from the sphere of where a political common good can actually take place, which is in local communities, local towns, cities with the authentic Aristotelian polis. And it shifts our focus away to these massive super states, which are really modern inventions. Those did not exist in medieval times. Those did not exist necessarily in ancient times. So I would say, to answer your last question, yes, I think that our response to the modern dilemma is to focus on our local communities and render them in whatever way we possibly can more fitting to the common good. In our local situation.
Great, thanks. Can I come in? I'm going to add some things to that. Everything that's been said so far, I agree with. The things that occur to me are that if we're going to exercise freedom well, then it has to come through love, and we promote love of the common good by an education that emphasizes beauty and culture. So it's part of that. As the way of beauty person, I'm bound to say that, but it's hugely neglected, and I would say even in those sort of classical academies that you see popping up, which are clearly, in my opinion, far better than what you see in the public schools. Even when beauty is discussed, it's a class in aesthetics. It's not really. There isn't a formation that promotes a love of culture and beauty in quite the same way. Maybe in music you get it. People are often taught Gregorian chant or something like that, and of course that's precious few do that. But certainly in art, there's very little, and it's rare, and it's seen as being recreation in a poor. I mean, it literally is recreation, but in a poor way. It's seen as being second rate in comparison to the real job of education, which is reading books and taking exams on what you read. And so that's the one thing. But then the other thing that occurs to me is we need courage to exercise our freedom. And if we don't exercise, you talked about agency, Father, but if we neglect we almost have a responsibility to exercise that agency, because society is hierarchical, and in different roles, we will be examples to others in the roles that we have. It depends, in one role, I might have be someone who people look up to. Each of us is in this position, whereas another, I'm looking to others. But if we don't exercise our freedom well, then the common good will not be manifested. If we can see that, we're not moving towards it as a society. And I think in the face of what's going on now, it's a sort of soft tyranny where people are not exercising their agency. And this is a lot of what Charlie's about. I'm thinking of this in the light of what Charlie's been talking about with his March for Life, March for Eternal Life. Things like that, being examples where we want to show cheerfully and courageously how to exercise that freedom. In the context of past discussions that we've had, it strikes me that even within the church, within the hierarchy of the church, we all have roles, and on the whole, we to a certain degree, even the pious are guilty of looking to Rome to sort things out, rather than us just getting on with it and doing it. And bishops seem to have neglected their agency and their exercise of freedom, and just not really stood up and done what is right when they're entitled to do so. They're not bound by Rome in every way. And as lay people, we are not dependent even on priests for much of what we do. Liturgically, for example, we can do the Liturgy of the Hours. There are things, we should look to reach up in our exercise of freedom as high as we can. And I think it's as much due to the neglect of each of us, of our agency, shall we say, as it is people seeking to obliterate it or remove it.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that in praise of the kind of liberalism or American liberalism, at least we have the option to pursue our own vision of the good, even if it might be in conflict with what's being put on display in the public square. And so there is more freedom, I think, than we tend to acknowledge to pursue our own vision of the good. And we can do that either in whatever city or place we're already in, or we can go outside of that system and try to build something new on the proverbial frontier. There's not quite as much geographical frontier as there used to be. So in Berkeley, I could maybe go to Alaska, or I could go to Montana. We could talk about seasteading, going on the ocean. But first, I just want to talk about the related idea, I think, of the Benedict option, which I understand to be not necessarily just expanding on your own community wherever you are, but specifically seeking out locales that are a little bit outside of the, kind of on the outskirts of Urbania and on the outskirts of this increasingly uncivilized civilization of cities and large institutions. So I'm torn between these two things. I'm torn between staying where I am and fighting the good fight and trying to go off the beaten path where there might already be some communities that are looking to step outside of the mainstream institutions. But that's my understanding of the Benedict option, is that it actually does involve moving out of your context to create and nurture something, just like Saint Benedict, in founding the monastic system. That was something that was kind of outside of the failing Roman Empire.
Yeah, I understand. That was from my point of view, that was my criticism of the Benedict option. Was too much? I felt was the emphasis of creating sort of ghettos and enclaves where you don't have to engage with a society that doesn't seem to share your values. Having said that, if you have a family, you have to fight to protect your family. So it's different. It depends on your state of life and your situation to the degree to which you do that. And then also it depends on the pressures. The one thing that I would say historically is that at the time that Benedict was setting up the monasteries, there was no city really that Rome had broken down. It wasn't the huge sort of metropolis that had been around the time of Christ or something like that.
Picturing wild animals running around the streets.
And, sort of like that. And there was
overgrown
civilization he wasn't escaping. He was going to where people were. But nevertheless, the monasteries themselves, wherever they had walls around them and were separated. But he was engaging, the situation of the monastery is not separate from society in that way. We tend to think of that now because we are mostly city or suburb dwellers. But actually, agriculture and the development of the land was the place where the population was getting on with their lives and doing it. So he was right in the thick of it in that sense. And then also there is this sort of traditional idea of going to the wilderness is not to escape society, but it's to engage with evil. That's where the devils are in there. And the Egyptian desert or something like that. So even then, there's an aspect of engagement in that. But that is but what I'm saying is not arguing against going to Alaska or Montana. I think because you have to be able to, you're balancing that with the exercise of freedom, and if you have responsibilities for families, that's a very different matter than if you are a single man, for example.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, I want to press actually, maybe argue against moving to Alaska or Montana, and press the point a little bit that Father Brad was making, that these giant states are modern inventions, and they're we would consider unnatural. I mean, if we follow the Aristotelian Thomistic classical idea of the political community,
Just
it
to
has,
clarify,
yeah,
you don't mean giant states like Alaska and Montana. You mean like the United States.
right, like the United States, right?
Like a
At least we
federal
can
government.
right, we can start here just with the United States. I mean, something really gigantic. I mean, Aristotle thought that because political communities are natural entities, they have a natural size, just like a human being. There's a range of size that constitute. But if you see a human being who's 10 feet tall, that's immediately a monster or something that's abnormal. And so I will take the position that our modern states, especially perhaps specifically the United States, is kind of a monstrosity. It emerged in the age of enlightenment. It emerged with these ideas of liberalism, with these faulty conceptions of the common good. And then with the Civil War, sort of, it became this gigantic sort of unit, right? I mean, whatever localism it had before the Civil War sort of disappeared. But now we're faced with living in this political community, which in a way we are called to love, although at the same time, we are called to hate it, because if you read the media and whatnot, we're supposed to right. I mean, we get all these mixed messages about how we're supposed to feel about the United States. But if we truly believe in this idea that political communities are natural entities, and maybe they're best represented by a city with its environment, right? This environment, right? A city and its countryside. Then shouldn't we just and given that God has put us, for whatever reason, where we are at the moment, shouldn't we just plant our flag here, or this or stake our ground and say, okay, this is where I am. I happen to be in San Francisco myself. It's a city, right? I mean, it's closer to what a political community ought to be than if I think about myself as a citizen of the United States, right? And let me just stay here and try to evangelize the city of San Francisco, and not be tempted to move right at the first whim of a persecution. Just go, or because I don't like it, I'm going to move somewhere else, or because we're otherwise always constantly moving. And I think Christians are equally guilty as our secular counterparts of just picking up our tent and going to greener pastures, which in a way is against what the love of the political common good calls us to do. It calls us in a way to just stay where we are and improve our natural environment, our natural political environment. Now, I say that as one thought, but at the same time, I realize that it's hardly tenable, just because the pervasive notion of the political common good is so different and contrary. I mean, are we expected, ourselves individually to, to try to evangelize not only directly about the faith, but also about this idea of living in a certain idea of the political community that we have in mind? It seems like a very tall order. But at the same time, I want to at least put it on the table here that maybe we should stay put and really be serious about what we mean when we say, local political community. And now there's also a movement, a secessionist movement, right? A secessionist sentiment in the United States, which maybe to some extent, even though it is not necessarily motivated by an understanding of the common good that we've discussed and we share here, but it may be motivated by a certain instinct about what the common good is, so that people say enough of top-down imposition from Washington. Let's just split up. Let's have our own states, the way we used to be, an understanding of how how states' autonomy, was, in the past, or maybe rediscover a new kind of localism. So those are my thoughts. But I'm thinking the main point I want to make is that in our own actions, if we don't want to be sort of hypocritical with what we claim to say about the common good, shouldn't we just stay where we are and say, I'm not moving, right? I'm part of this. I may not like it very much right now, but if I work at it, I may eventually, develop a certain natural love for the community that I live in.
Well, but presumably there is a point. I mean, we're not all called to be like Socrates, who will follow his principles to the point of taking hemlock, which sounds like
right, exactly
with the extreme of what you're describing.
Right,
I don't know whether that's prudent either. So I think there's a spectrum there. But the question I'd throw back at you is that I think there is something natural to the nation, and now, whether that really is the United States, I think the model of the Constitution, I'm not going to say I could improve on that, but whether it really works in the current United States, given that the population is so much greater now, and there is it's almost breaking up into sort of different nations, whatever that means. But it occurs to me that, and I'm looking to others here who know more about Aristotelian ideas than me, but it's something that wasn't really contained within Aristotle as being a sort of a natural entity. He stopped at the polis, but maybe that's because he didn't, for him, the nation was a given. They were all Greeks. And then beyond that, they weren't even people, really. So he didn't really address things on a worldwide basis in the way that we would. And it might be that there is a natural size of a nation or a natural order which is not necessarily present in the US. I think of things like in Europe, and I'm not presenting that by any means as a perfect system at all, but nevertheless, you do have these smaller states where I'm thinking, for example, Denmark it seems to work very successfully in many ways, and it's wrong. The left misrepresents it as a model, as far as I can tell. But what you have there is a well-developed welfare state, but strong sort of cultural cohesion, and its population is less than the Bay Area, and so you could have federal principles as described. Maybe Switzerland is the same, for example. You have a constitution there, which apparently is based on the US Constitution. I think that's right, and was established in about the 1830s or something. 4 cantons with a lot of autonomy, but there's greater Swiss cohesion, and it's a much smaller level. So now, this wouldn't have been a problem for the US in the past, in that, although it was huge geographically, it was still more cohesive in terms of the population, especially as it was largely focused on the sort of European Anglo-Saxon, I'm going to say. But now we consider all people in different ways. Maybe there is a fragmentation there, and there's a natural ordering that could take place. I'm just going to throw those ideas out there.
David, I think I agree with you entirely, and I also want to just riff a little bit more on what Michelle was saying about the sort of natural size of the political common good. The political common good will have a certain there'll be a certain natural proportion, which is proportion to what? And I would say it has to be proportion to the natural sphere of human love, because the common good is common good is a cause. Common good is always a cause that moves like a final cause, and so it pulls us towards a good through our love. And so the natural sphere, the natural scope of the political common good would be precisely the natural range of authentic, natural human love. This is why the family is the nucleus of where the human person learns the common good. because that's the natural sphere of love, where a human person learns to love something more than itself. Then you have concentric spheres that go outside of that village, well, the neighborhood, the village, the polis, then the nation. All are authentic spheres of political common goods, since they represent a certain sphere or a certain good that can pull a human love. And so this is the key. Something like you mentioned Denmark, David, or Switzerland, or some of these Scandinavian nations, where it seems like a type of welfare state or nanny state works very well. Now, this is very, very misunderstood by Americans. And why is that? It's because these very small Scandinavian nations already have a very strong principle of cohesion that is able to order them through love towards one another. They have a very strong principle of a principle that unites them. I would say a thriving welfare state cannot create the common good. A thriving welfare state only presupposes a common good that already exists.
Okay.
For example, every family functions this way. The father earns the income, and then he feeds his children. Would we call that a welfare state? No, we wouldn't call that a welfare state. That's just the family. This is what the family does, because that's the natural order of love. That's the natural order of love. If a father has 12 children and he only has medicine for one child, he gives the medicine to the child that's sick. We don't call that a preferential option for the sick. No, you just call that normal. That's just what human love does, because that's justice, right? Of course, you don't, that's not a scalable reality into infinity. So the idea that you can have shared stuff or distributed things amongst multiple agents in a nation, that like you had in a family or in a small village, this is in no way a scalable reality that can go all the way up to the nation. For example, and I think let's say, okay, the United States federal government is going to provide for every citizen what is the basic requirements for natural human flourishing. Let's just say that. Okay, if we say that the federal government will provide every citizen with basics for natural human flourishing, this already presupposes a collective corporate idea of what human flourishing looks like. It already presupposes the common good. It presupposes a type of family unity on top of which any kind of welfare state would actually work in justice and not actually render more injustice possible. Because very quickly someone will say, well, natural human flourishing requires the right to abortion. Natural human flourishing requires that the government pay for my 4 or 5 year college degree and then my master's degree and all this stuff. So immediately, if you already have a pluralistic, massive super state like the United States of America, you have something so large, you by that very nature, you don't have the conditions. You don't have the conditions that would render a welfare state like Denmark or Sweden at all a just society, because it's simply not scalable, because the common good must only operate on the sphere of human love. And human beings love their local communities. Human beings, this is why I think, Michelle, I think you have a great point where it's saying you love San Francisco, that's your city. And a city is a place where a human being lives, a place where a human being has a home and learns to love. So it's not that the human person just looks at all the cities on the market and then picks the correct city to be a citizen of. That's not how citizenship works. Citizenship works because we are, as embodied human creatures, as soul and body composites, we belong in a place. And we learn to love a place. We are not angels that can just go anywhere willy-nilly. We are material creatures that belong in a locale, and we're called to a locale, and then we learn to love a certain place. And then our love for that place will determine our agency in that place. And that's why I appreciate your point, David, about courage. I think the very presence of the massive modern superstate has fooled us into thinking that we have no agency, that the superstate will do everything for us. The nanny state will take care of our community. The nanny state will take care of the poor in our midst. The nanny state will take care of educating my kids. The nanny state will take care of me when I have a fever. And this is a great. I think it's a that those are the occasions that lead to lack of virtue, because people don't learn to take ownership of the place where they live. They don't learn to take a natural ownership of their own homes and their neighborhoods, their city streets. They don't take ownership of their village, and then just immediately alienate all that responsibility to something like the superstate. And that's a huge problem I see in the modern world. So that's just my riff on those ideas.
There's a perfect segue here. There's two things that come to mind, and I'll start with just one of them, which is this idea of habitat and bioregion, which I've been thinking about a lot in the context of movement. And this concept of exercise is a modern concept. I don't think Ivan Illich ever really put his sights on exercise, but that would have been an interesting area where I would like to see his critique, because I think that there is this whole sort of fitness industrial complex that puts fitness literally in a box with these big box gyms. And human beings throughout history have always maintained fitness by just going out into their environment, and whether providing for their material needs or engaging in leisure activities, these were the ways that we stayed healthy. And so I'm giving a little presentation with another guy who's thinks he's also an Illichian, incidentally, named Frank Ferencic. And I encourage people, I think, to check him out for a very different perspective than the one that we've been exploring here. Frank Ferencic goes by the exuberant animal, doesn't come at these issues with a Christian perspective, but is very much concerned with the idea of treating our local habitat well. And I think that this is one way to conceive of the environmental movement, and how that went awry is that it was coupled with the idea of sort of the mega state, or even an entire planetary system, missing the fact that most environmental damage actually takes place at a very local level. And it's something that we can actually do something about if we don't get lost in this sort of impossible objective of saving the world, or putting everyone under planetary government that can restrict our freedom so that we don't pollute too much. There are so many more solutions than just delegating this responsibility to a big behemoth. And if I may also kind of segue from this into the other topic of the size of government being the relevant question, the number of countries in the world. If we have 200 countries, as we do now, that's going to be a very different world from one where there's 2 countries or 2,000 countries. And so it doesn't require, maybe you'll have people in a world with more countries and freer movement between them. Maybe you will have some people that don't feel a particular allegiance to the place that they're born, but they find another place that better suits that they love more, that they can call home. And then out of this ecosystem of many sort of competing countries, you have, I think that inherently leads to better governance and a better promotion of the common good. And that's actually the thought experiment that kind of kicks off the whole concept of seasteading, which is new countries on the ocean. But without getting into that whole can of worms, I think that just framing it through this lens of what will the world look like in 50 years or in 100 years if we have 2 countries versus 2,000 countries. I'd much rather live in the latter world, where there's greater choice of where you live, and that becomes sort of the relevant decision. You can either fight to change your country, or you can leave and vote with your feet, so to speak.
Michelle, did you want to speak before I come in again? Okay. It's funny. I'm listening. Very interesting, Charlie. Thanks. I was as you were speaking, I was thinking of the situation in the UK. I mentioned Switzerland with its 4 cantons, which had effectively American-style constitution placed on it, and it seems to work very well. Interestingly, they have never been part of the European Union. They sort of cooperate with it, always remained separate, had a very strong sense of self-sufficiency. And the UK, it's interesting that there's this funny split of allegiance where I come from. So we have these currently 4 countries within the UK, Northern Ireland, and there's a problem there in that Irish people, just from the very name, they feel Northern Irish, but they feel Irish, and and then in Northern Ireland, many people also feel British, and then or part of the UK. But that's a complexity that maybe muddies the waters a little. But if you look at the Great Britain, you have Scotland, England, and Wales, and there is a natural allegiance. So Scotland has a soccer team, England has a soccer team, Wales does, but then we most people, I would say, have this natural allegiance to Britain as well. So that they've had there's a big movement for Scottish independence, but it's never gone all the way through to total independence. So when it comes down to it, it's almost as if they just can't bring themselves to do it. And I think the problem there, incidentally, as a joke, my brother and I said it was unfair that the English didn't get a vote on Scottish independence, because we'd have liked to have voted in favour, but we'd had a chance. But I think maybe what's going on here is that actually we have a Switzerland situation in that it isn't just Scotland is a natural entity. That, I mean, they sound different, they feel a cohesion, but they also feel a part of Britain. The problem in Britain is that historically England is the dominant nation, and the government system is sort of central to England, and they haven't worked. The devolution is imbalanced. It really isn't worked out. So that as soon as you start giving powers to Wales and to Scotland, the English people lose out because they're not considered a region in the same way. They're just identified with the central government. And so the poorer areas of the UK, of England, like Northern England, are actually suffer more than those in Scotland and Wales in terms of sort of government programs and this sort of thing. And that's part of the problem that created all this sort of working class shift to the conservative, all these sort of dynamic shifts in voter, the way that populations have voted. Now, if there had been a Switzerland situation where you had this sense of a federal government that with very limited, they seem to have maintained it in Switzerland, very limited scope, and then strong autonomy in the regions, but strong cooperation between them, maybe that would be the way forward for the UK. And what we're seeing there in Britain is a problem because of the natural allegiances of populations occurring.
There are also these secession light options that you could have in places like the United States, where states are given more autonomy. They become something more like a country, but then still under the banner of the United States. And I think that was really kind of the original architecture of the Constitution, was a more federalistic system where we don't have to care what is happening in Texas or Florida if we believe in kind of California values, or vice versa. The Florida people don't have to be so concerned with what's happening in California. We can just, to some extent, live and let live, but also have a cohesive sense of an identity as both a smaller subset of the nation, and hopefully there will be enough of a national cohesion to keep the overarching system together.
Right.
And what would destroy that, though, sort of vast amounts of movement and motion where people come in who do not share those values, that
Mhm.
will destroy that. And so that's not hating foreigners. It's saying that the demand for people to uh, integrate culturally is natural too, and it's right. And you almost say, don't come unless you want to do that. That's the natural consequence of what we're arguing, and that is a problem, I think.
Mm-hmm. Right, but
so you can have huge numbers coming in. If they integrate, that maintains the culture, but if it splits the society, then it's a problem. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a problem already. Even if for a secessionist movement of sorts, it's already a problem because we're already enmeshed into very fundamental disagreements, among people who live in any kind of geographic area currently in the United States, with people with very different understandings and aspirations about the common good and what it means to live together. But so I want to say, David, what you were saying, I want to sort of uh, uh, agree with your comment about the nation. So I think political communities, we have to realize that really, I mean, even though they are natural, they're not the same as a natural substance like a human being or a dog or a tree or whatnot. I mean, they're historically contingent, right? And they're historically contingent, and they evolve, and they depend on fallen human action, right? And historically, so nations have emerged because cities have notoriously been at war with each other all the right. So the Greeks, the reason Alexander was able to unite the Greek cities because they were fighting all the time. And likewise with empires. So empires have always, the Roman Empire imposed the Pax Romana, right? So it was the trade-off. You lose your localism, you lose your own natural political common good in exchange for a peace imposed by Washington D.C. or Rome or or Macedon or whatever it is. And so I think that's a human reality that makes this paradox so difficult to to deal with, and for us individually so difficult to sort of navigate. I also want to say that I agree with you that there's an element of vocation, right? So we're not called to be to sacrifice our family good and whatnot just for the sake of the political common good, even though in a sense there's a sense in which the political common good is greater than the personal good. But we have to to have the proper understanding of what it is we're supposed to do individually in the here and now. And the Holy Family emigrated from from Bethlehem to go to Egypt when they were persecuted. So there's a time for there's a time for everything. So I'm saying platitudes here. And at the end of the day, I don't have an answer for the paradox with which we I opened the conversation here today.
It's interesting. I have that this is just a sort of an idea that came into my head, is that the number of nations, what is the ideal number? We're probably not there. We're heading towards it. And just from my sort of reading of sort of interpretations of scripture, where they talk of the apostles catching the nations in their nets. I was reading that the other day. And so I think maybe 153 nations is eventually by the end. How that will appear, I don't know, but I see 153. And it was approximately that before that, all the things split recently, in the last 25 years or whatever, is 40 years actually.
Yeah.
Things have split. But nevertheless, that is shifting. That does change with time, and I just don't know where. I believe that by the end of times, we will be at that sort of ideal number somehow.
Well, I mean, historically, if you look at Europe, right? I mean, there was the dominance. I mean, it was the Roman Empire for a while, and then you had essentially a secessionist movement when it broke down. Then you had all kinds of medieval Europe was a whole bunch of even though there was in name the Holy Roman Empire in the West, but it was very ineffectual, and essentially you had all kinds of principalities and little kingdoms and fiefdoms and so forth. And in a way, I think that those were at least maybe to my romantic idea of the time, they seemed appealing. But again, there must have been some problems because it led to another movement of consolidation and dominance from a central authority and so forth. So I think it's always going to vacillate between those two poles. But right now, I'm sympathetic, at least in the U.S., to a secessionist movement, even though I don't think it stands any practical chance of proceeding peacefully. I think if there is secession, it's going to be pretty violent, just because you can't segregate people. I mean, people are living together now with very diverse, very opposite views.
And I would say that it highlights the evil, I'm going to say, of the sort of Marxist-driven ideas, which are inherently divisive. So that even within a Marxist state with central authority, the very ideas promote this sort of continual sort of destruction of society and division of man, just contained within the philosophy itself, and that is hugely problematical.
Yeah, and I want to. Sorry, continue, Michelle.
No, go ahead, Father Brad.
Well, Marx understood, and even a lot of the classical thinkers, Aquinas also understood this, that the division of all of what we would call kind of subsidiary communities, the destruction of family, the destruction of local communities, and the atomization of all individuals, society, is just a precursor to the modern superstate. It's just the taking over of control of all now atomized, isolated individuals. The family, and then strong local communities that can elicit then that love from the person, the common good, is the greatest bulwark against tyranny, and the greatest ticket, the fastest ticket towards tyranny, is the atomized individual. Marx understood that.
Right. Correct. Interestingly, and then the atomized, the view that leads essentially to a universalist, world government type thing. And I just want to make one at least for me, one last thing. David, you were mentioning scripture. There's also a passage in scripture that I think maybe frequently misunderstood, which is the episode of the Tower of Babel, when at the end God comes and confuses their tongues, right, and splits them up. And if you read it casually, it sounds like a punishment, that they be divided and separated from one another. When in fact, if you look at before they started building the Tower of Babel, all these people were actually, they each had their own culture and language, right? And I think it's Genesis, I think if it's chapter 9 or 10, they're all presented in the aftermath of the flood, right, when they're rebuilding, as different nations, each with its own language and culture, and essentially, or trade or whatever. And then they get into their mind the idea of banding together and constructing the Tower of Babel. And God essentially intervenes, but then restores the natural separation that existed between the nations.
Indeed.
So I think a point that I was making, I think, on a previous episode, is that we live in distinct political communities naturally, and that's a good thing, right? I think there's a natural division of labor among political communities. We're supposed to, take care of this planet and this garden in separate political communities, and we shouldn't conquer each other or be at war with one another or be jealous or covetous of one another. We should respect, right? I mean, ideally, I think that was the plan, that we would have each our own material possession, the land in which the nation would that the nation would cultivate. But our ambitions and our distorted mind and will and intellect, has led to this, perpetual historical struggle and shifts back and forth between war and empire.
So the United Nations is a Tower of Babel.
Yeah, essentially. essentially. Certainly, the EU
Yeah.
is.
I love it.
The EU is in many ways,
Yeah.
and perhaps to some extent the federal, I mean the centralized federal government that has emerged, after the Civil War, and that has continued to become more and more sort of centralized and important and all dominant. Um, but of course, you say that you get accused of being a racist and all that kind of stuff. So but so be it.
Well,
All
Michelle, I
right.
think that's a fantastic point. Thank you for closing with that. So,
Yeah. Anything else? Anybody else before we finish our first season here?
No, fantastic. It's been a pleasure to be part of this. That's
Okay,
all
great. Well, then I want to invite the audience to subscribe to whatever channel we're on. It's going to be on YouTube and all all the other video channels and podcast channels, and the God, Man, and Markets podcast. And we look forward to season 2, which we're preparing right now. And I think there'll be other conversations on similar themes. But I think I hope the audience will enjoy them as much as I have. So on that note, goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
So long for now.